This is a talk about policy and market failure and how the cultural world is changing. Let me start with where we were. There used to be this thing called cultural economics, which was centered on organizations. And there were a number of economic problems that cultural organizations had. So the old cultural economics would typically focus upon theater, musical performance, Broadway shows, a lot of live performance, a lot of not-for-profit culture. And people would do studies of particular organizations and how well they were doing, what the elasticity of demand was. Culture was the symphony orchestra. It was treated as something quite well defined. And in this older literature, when it came to the policy issues, there were three major issues, at least, which I'll just review briefly. But we're going to see really how these have changed. But just to review where they were, three of the major issues in the older literature. The first was you would ask the question, does culture have some kind of positive or perhaps even negative externality in society? So one argument for subsidizing the arts was a kind of educational argument. If you have a symphony orchestra or an opera company, this produces outputs which somehow elevates people or educates them or makes them better citizens. And therefore, that was an argument for some kind of subsidy. That was just called the externalities argument. The second argument, which was originally unique to the economics of the arts, is called Baumel's cost disease. Some of you already know this, but just to review this argument, Baumel and Bowen, in a famous 1966 book, made the now famous claim that there are some sectors of the economy which are less productive than other sectors. And they claimed this was true of the performing arts. There's a very famous example they have. Baumel and Bowen said it takes 4 men today about 40 minutes to play a Mozart string quartet. Back in 1780, how long did it take 4 men to play the same Mozart string quartet? Well, back then it still took them about 40 minutes. So the claim was you have some sectors of the arts which are technologically stagnant, and that over time they will take up a larger and larger share of GDP. Relative prices will turn against them. And perhaps, as was suggested by Baumel and Bowen, these sectors of the economy also will need some subsidy. This claim since then has spread out from economics of the arts. You hear it cited sometimes for education. Like how much better is a teacher today at teaching the alphabet than 100 years ago? Some people say we've gotten worse at that. But the belief is if there's something that's very labor intensive, take a barber. How much better is a barber today at cutting your hair than 50 years ago? And so on. So a lot of parts of the service economy have been claimed to be technologically stagnant. And that has been a big part of what I'm calling the older cultural economics. The third argument, which is a bit taken from philosophy, you find this most prominently in Richard Musgrave, is what's called the merit goods argument. And this perhaps goes beyond economics, but the merit goods argument was and still is the claim that even if markets are operating quite well, there's something special about the arts, and we ought to have more of the arts, or more of a particular kind of art than markets will provide. So if you were to apply the merit goods claim to the opera, you might be convinced that, say, the opera had no externalities. It doesn't really elevate people. Maybe opera companies can support themselves through donations. Maybe the cost disease is not fatal. But nonetheless, people claim there's just something good about the idea of having more opera, and economic efficiency is not the only value. And therefore, there's this third case for government subsidizing the arts, and that's what I'm calling merit goods. But to philosophers, this really is from Plato. It's not called merit goods at all. It's simply some notion of intrinsic value. So the way things were, you would have these arguments, and they would be applied to this fairly well-defined set of activities called cultural goods and services. Now, what I'm working on and what I'm suggesting in this paper is that this old world has changed very dramatically in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, and that when it comes to delivering cultural content, there's probably been more change in the last 10 to 15 years than in any other period of human history. This is not generally disputed, but what is the case is we haven't really thought through what are the new ways of thinking about policy in the contemporary environment. So I'm going to go to policy issues shortly, But let me just review in very general terms what I think have been the very big changes in cultural markets. But just to preface that, part of the changes have been that what is culture now is less well defined than it used to be. So if you do something on the internet, if you read a blog, is it literature? Well, it's not literature in the old sense, but you might enjoy it some way. A lot of the videos on YouTube, say it's a quick comedy skit, is that culture? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But as the internet allows the economy to become more diverse, what you see are more activities that are on the fringe of culture. They maybe wouldn't fit older definitions of culture. But from the point of view of consumers, there's something cultural about them. And for better or worse, consumers are sometimes using them as a substitute for older forms of culture. So instead of going out to the opera, maybe you sit at home and you watch a 3-minute aria on YouTube and it's free. That would be a very simple comparison. But just to sum up this new world, the new issues in cultural economics, and I'll work through these. The first is collecting payment for intellectual property, which is not a completely new issue, but it's become a lot more pressing because of digitalization. The second is information and the culture glut. So instead of Baumel's cost disease, what we have are some cultural forms, not all, but they can be produced and or distributed very, very cheaply. So the economics of the area, it's more like Malthusian economics. There's so much, and you have to ask what survives, or how do people choose, how do people allocate their attention. For these particular sectors, there's really no problem of cost being too high. You might even think there's a problem of cost being too low. There's a third issue, which I'm listing here as monopoly on the web. Monopoly is not exactly the right word, because often price is at zero. But there's some kind of concentration of attention. So if you want to do a web search, how many of you here go to dogpile.com? How many of you here go to Google? Basically all of you. You look things up on Wikipedia. It's not the only wiki, but again, it's a lot of concentration there. Some people use barnesandnoble.com. Does anyone here? Three people. But most of you probably use Amazon. And if you want to buy like a nice textile at online auction, odds are you're going to eBay. If you want an electronic book reader, you might have Sony, but it seems Kindle there is becoming the standard. So we're seeing the internet, it's amazingly diverse in some ways, but at the same time there's something about it that leads to these extraordinary concentrations of interest in certain sites rather than others. So maybe these are monopolies in a sense, but they're not monopolies in the sense of raising prices to consumers. But nonetheless, there'll be policy issues from that, and there are some people at least who are nervous about this concentration of attention. Finally, there's a fourth issue which may appear separate, but as we'll see at the end of this talk, it's not, and that is the collapsing macroeconomy. And what does this mean for arts and arts policy? As you may know, as I speak, the Senate is debating whether to increase the budget of the NEA by another $50 million. And we can expect they will vote on this before dinner tonight. So if they're talking about it, I figure I should be too. But to understand the question of, if we're going to spend this money, how should we spend it as stimulus on the arts, we need first a deeper model of where the art sector is heading. So I'm going to save that for last, but we are very much getting to it. If we're going to do stimulus for the arts, what's the best way to do it? But these are the new issues. The new cultural institutions, probably you're all familiar with these. iPod, iPhone, blogs, Facebook, YouTube, watching kind of TV on the web. You could say computer games, Second Life, virtual reality platforms. These are all big deals. They don't necessarily generate a lot of revenue. So as a percentage of GDP, they don't look very impressive. But if you look at how much consumer attention they command, we find it's really quite remarkable. And again, 20 years ago, these things simply did not exist. And in some cases, 5 years ago or less, maybe they existed, but they were not very important. So the big revolution in cultural economics, in a nutshell, has been this stuff and related innovations. And again, we're just going to try to think through what does this mean for policy. How is it changing the cost function? How is it changing the externalities issues in cultural markets? What does it mean for what we should actually do? But this stuff probably you're all familiar with because you're doing it. So if there are any problems, the root cause of the problem is in a sense you. But to ask the simple question, are there externalities from these developments, is an oddly underexplored area in cultural economics. I gave a talk to a group of cultural economists less than a year ago, and these are all people who specialize in cultural economics. And it was interesting. I asked them some very simple questions. I pulled out, one of these, which I suspect you all recognize, and I asked them what it was. Most of them didn't know. Now, this was a while ago, but it wasn't the day after it came out. I then brought my Kindle, and I pulled that out. At that time, Kindle had been out only about a month. And I asked them, who knows what this is? One person kind of guessed that it was a Kindle, but wasn't sure, and no one else knew. So cultural economics itself hasn't kept up, I think, with new technologies. What we need is a simple model of how digital culture differs. And there are a number of ways we can think about, like, how having this matters. That's really the fundamental economic question. In terms of a model, how does this change the problem of the consumer and the producer? That's like the core question I'm working on. And let me just run through a number of ways I'm thinking about it. But I think they're all boiling down to the same thing. One way to think about why this matters is what economists call the Alchian and Allen theorem. The Alchian and Allen theorem is really about filters. The Alchian and Allen theorem says when per unit costs are high, you don't bother with the cheap stuff. That's just common intuition. Like, how many of you hear Twitter? 1, 2, 3. What twittering is, it's like microblogging. It's a web service. You post very short ideas. They're usually just a sentence. You put something up on your Twitter account. People can read what you're doing, what bar you're drinking at, what movie you just saw, why you love your mother. It's limited basically to a short, pithy bit. That's called twittering. To get on the Twitter site is super easy, super quick. My password is keyed in. I can put up a Twitter post like in 3 seconds, 4 seconds. It's really quick. So there are things I will Twitter that I wouldn't bother to pick up the phone and call someone. You pick up the phone, you look for your cell phone, here it is. You turn it on, you wait, it makes the funny noise. You press the button, it rings and rings. You get the answering machine. You wait for it. If someone picks up, maybe they want to talk to you about something you don't want to talk to them about, so you don't make the call. You're like afraid of the phone. It seems so cheap. But relative to Twitter, the phone's really expensive. That's a way of thinking about the trade-off. So the small bit does not get sent over the phone. It doesn't get published in a large encyclopedia, but it does get put up on your Twitter account. So when things are just generally cheaper, you'll get a lot more small bits, is the basic economic idea. And that's just a way of formalizing what I think is common sense. You'll put stuff up on Twitter, a blog, that you wouldn't write a whole book about. Another way of putting this point about small bits is what I call mixing and matching. People sometimes call it multitasking, though I think that word is a little misleading. But a way a lot of cultural consumption works, if I think of myself, say when I talk with my daughter who's 19, she'll like come over, demand my attention, show me 2 minutes of a YouTube video, play a song for me, show me like a snippet on TiVo, tell me something, and then have me look at a blog post with her, like all jumbled together. I do this myself. This is very common. Or like you'll have the TV on, you'll turn the sound off, you'll put on music, maybe you'll hook up your iPod to a speaker stuff. You'll talk to someone else. Some of the time you're on your cell phone, you're texting, and you're writing your PhD thesis. Like some mix of those at the same time. But the point is, if you have small bits, there are a lot more opportunities to mix and match. So the culture people consume, it's not just what is sent to them. What's sent to them are small bits. And in some way, they remix the small bits the way they want it. So they watch part of a TV show. They watch part of a YouTube clip. You can think of these CDs that like mix together different musical forms as another instance of this form. So in economic lingo, there's a lot more of what we call household production going on. That is, consumers add meaning to the stuff. This is an old idea in postmodernism, but in postmodern theory, the consumers add the meaning by interpreting what they're sent. Here, consumers add more meaning in a very literal way of like physically remixing what they're sent and combining it in a new way. If you know Gary Becker's work on household production functions, it's another way of thinking about it. Also, Kelvin Lancaster, who was at Chicago in the 60s, he had this idea of what he called characteristics. But a lot more of culture, it's like produced by the mix in the individual mind. So it's not necessarily something that's sold to you, but you take a bunch of these bits, you remix them, you rejumble them in some way you want, you reinterpret them in some new way, you show it to a friend. A lot of the value is value added by you. It's like added by your mind. So it's a different cost structure than if something is prepackaged, you drive for 90 minutes, you go to the opera, you sit there for 3.5 hours, they stream you something, then you go home. A lot more household production. So in pictures, you know, the old cultural model is this. Opera, long, expensive, prepackaged. New cultural model, you know, is more like this. It's silly, absurd actually. I put this on a PowerPoint, you know, when I have one here. It just goes to show how web-obsessed we can be. Anyway, let me go on. One reason that the canon issue matters is that a lot of art subsidies are typically directed towards something which is canonical in some way. And the harder it is to have a canon, it then becomes problematic what it is you should subsidize. One thing I'd point out is what people typically regard as an issue with copyright. There's a lot of illegal downloading or stealing of material. That's just one example of this more general problem that prices are lower. And that even if all pirating were removed, there'd be a lot of general forces making prices for things just generally much lower. I mentioned the music industry. Also, if you look at the book industry, there's been, even before the recession or depression, there was ongoing massive triage and people putting out smaller advances to authors, fewer titles with paid advances. If you look at journalism, which from the point of view of this model counts as a form of culture, even if you don't think journalism is itself very cultural, but it's produced by the same technology, and now it's competing against something online. So there used to be a cross-subsidy to direct reporting. That cross-subsidy has been removed. People are reading smaller bits online, whether it's online newspapers or blogs or whatever. So with the cross-subsidy removed, journalism is shrinking very rapidly. And that's not because of a piracy problem. No one is like surreptitiously Xeroxing copies of the LA Times and passing it around. So it's hard to compete against free, is the basic problem there. And there's again shrinkage and again a world that's good for consumers, bad for producers. Question, what are the externalities of the new cultural forms? To me is really a central question. And I think there's two main arguments I've seen, which are not yet validated, but what I'm working on is thinking these through. So skip ahead here, and trying to make sense of them analytically. The first has to do with what I call the new cultural monopolies, the new like zero price monopolies. Now, Amazon is not zero price in the sense of the books being free, but you don't have to pay to go to the site. And it's easier to go to Amazon than to a bookstore. But if you look, say, at Google, Amazon, eBay, Wikipedia, iTunes, possibly the way Kindle evolves, there's something that these models have in common. And I think of it as a kind of gateway model. That the focal website is interested in becoming a gateway, a kind of name that every consumer knows. So the goal is to load the site with as much stuff as possible and basically make the site as attractive as possible. And there's a kind of cross-subsidy. You put stuff on the site, there's an externality captured in the brand name of the site. So the brand name of Facebook, Wikipedia, eBay, Amazon, Google is worth a lot. It's like the iTunes model. There's a gain from either the hardware or the brand name. So the incentive is to supply the content really quite cheaply. So a classic example of this was Amazon's decision to list used books on its site. You go to Amazon, you want to buy a book, and you can, one click and buy it new. And right there in the same iSite is, here's like 17 used copies, at prices all lower. When Amazon did this, this was a decision hated by the publishing trade for obvious reasons. They realize all of a sudden they're competing against used books in a very direct way. It's another big reason why book revenues are much smaller than they used to be. Even people who did web companies thought Amazon was making a mistake. They thought the Amazon model should be to get the price of books being quite high and then take a cut of that. Amazon realized the gains from being the focal site with the best content, the best opportunities, are what capitalizes value in the brand name. So Amazon, in essence, made prices lower than producers wanted the prices to be. And that's something we're seeing pop up repeatedly as this core tendency, a dominant intermediary, which in a way looks like a monopoly. The old monopolies, the problem, at least ostensibly, was prices that are too high. The new monopolies, I'm not going to necessarily call it a problem, but what you get is, from the producer's point of view, prices which are too low. And you end up in an equilibrium where you have gateway systems. They have phenomenal range of choice. If you look at any of these, Google, Amazon, eBay, Wikipedia, iTunes, YouTube, it's amazing what's on there. But there's something about the network that's created. It seems to discriminate against the creation of value through high price, high quality outputs. And that, I think, in a nutshell, is what's happening to a lot of cultural markets. You have a gateway model, which for the most part is good for consumers who get a lot more stuff, cheaper or free. But the chance to establish a market beachhead for something that's high price and high quality is now lower than it used to be, precisely because the gateway has the incentive to be offering you stuff quite cheaply. So there's this core bias in gateway systems, which is probably a net gain in terms of total welfare, producer and consumer surplus. But people who like relatively high price, high quality culture will feel in part that the network for that has been taken away from them. So let's say you're someone who likes to read a very thick, well-reported Sunday newspaper with a lot of book reviews. This is essentially what is disappearing. You are worse off. The world as a whole is probably better off. But there's this one class of customer who in the new order is worse off. So a lot of the old cultural models are in fact being penalized, and there's been this very fundamental shift. And from the point of view of arts policy, this, I think, is the core problem of what's going on. It's not the cost disease anymore, and it's not about externalities in the sense of if you go to the opera, you become a better person, or you vote better, or whatever the claim might be. It's that one segment of the market finds itself undercut. There's a few ways you can think about how the undercutting happens. You might think there's some undercutting because there are fixed costs, and that if you shift demand into the cheaper stuff, the more expensive stuff can't pay for itself anymore. That's possible, but there's also a sense in which it's not fixed costs in the production function. Simply consumption of culture has a large common element to it. So if people want to be consuming the same culture that other people are consuming, you want to talk about the same operas, the same Shakespeare plays, the same YouTube videos, if you shift some set of people into the cheaper network, it's then harder for the more expensive, higher price, higher quality network to sustain itself because of both fixed costs and commonalities on the end of the consumers. So that's the core trend, where there is this, it seems, very real externalities on the people who want to consume the high price, high value, high quality cultural items. The other set of externalities, which are cited a lot, but I've never seen evidence for that I think is credible, it has to do with attention span. So there's another argument. There have been at least 10 books that have come out in the last 5 years saying that what's fundamentally wrong in modern society is that we have shorter attention spans. Oddly, none of these books really have any legs. Like a new one comes out every few months. The last one is forgotten. I think one of them, like Susan Jacoby's The Age of Unreason. But the books themselves have very short shelf lives. And then there's like a new book, oh, short attention span. Another book, short attention span. And there's a well-known article by Nicholas Carr in the Atlantic Monthly. It was called, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And there's not really an underlying economic model given, but I interpret this in terms of an underlying economic model. And I take that model to be one about like customer monitoring. That if you're consuming too many things at once, you can't monitor the quality of any one of them very well. There might be some fixity to how many things you can monitor. So even though you get to sample lots of fun things, maybe the overall quality of customer monitoring goes down. Consider the classic metaphor of going to the same neighborhood restaurant year after year after year. You're a pretty good monitor of that restaurant. If it gets worse or they slip up, you know. You complain, you can talk to the chef, you can tell your friends who go to the same restaurant. Maybe there's something efficient about that monitoring. Let's say you win the lottery. You now have a more fun life. You have more money. You fly around the world. You buy a yacht. Every night you dine in a different restaurant. Every night of your life. For you it's more fun, but what has happened to your value as a monitor? Your value as a sampler has gone up, but your value of a monitor of quality of a given restaurant has gone down. So it could be if people are diversifying their consumption more, and I say could be, I don't think there's evidence for this, but this is really the claim that somehow people are too scattered in their attention, and there's something about the quality of output that declines in response to that. There's some reasons you can think why that might not be true. So if you think of the question, is Google making us stupid? The vision of the critics is that instead of doing something like reading a 900-page Russian novel, you just sit there and like enter queries into Google hour after hour after hour, and each query is different. It's not obvious to me that this is how people use Google. You could argue people use Google to pursue long-run interests, that they've read a 900-page Russian novel and they want to read reviews of it, or that they want to find out what's the 900-page Russian novel to read. So another more optimistic way of looking at this scenario is there's some shift out of long-term projects into short-term projects, but you use the short-term to get good long-term projects, and it's easier to follow long-term stories. It's easier to find out what's the best translation of Tolstoy or whatever it is you want to do. So this I'm not sold on, but this is really the main cultural criticism that's made today of contemporary internet-based culture, is something to do with a lower attention span. The critics who make this point, they're very fond of citing some studies from cognitive psychology. I've read a few of these, not all of them, but in general I don't find them convincing. This is what the study typically does. They take a person and they have a person perform a task, like you try to do a crossword puzzle or you try to solve some equations, and then they keep on interrupting you. And they find that the more times they interrupt you, the less well you do on the crossword puzzle, or the less well you do solving the equations. Or instead of having you just try to solve the crossword puzzle, they'll give you the crossword puzzle and the equations and ask you to do like half of both in the same amount of time. And they find, I think not surprisingly, that when you put more tasks or interruptions on people, essentially against their will, that people don't do as well. So when you exogenously impose interruptions on people, quality of the task goes down. There's a lot of evidence for that. But I'm less convinced that's evidence for the fact that voluntarily chosen interruptions limit our productivity. So if you're ever in the habit of writing and checking your email more or less sequentially, surely you ask yourself the question, does checking my email lower my writing productivity? Maybe it does. I'm not convinced it doesn't, but I'm also not convinced it does, because if the alternative to checking your email is getting up to make a sandwich, the interruption that you're controlling, that's part of your flow, you're choosing, rather than being put on you by the experimenter, I think it's much harder to show that that lowers your productivity. And current recession / depression aside, it's far from clear that the web has lowered people's productivity. The classic story in the 90s is that information technology was making us all more productive. So this one I regard as very much requiring further research. So this is like one of the potential new market failures. And the other one has to do with this gateway effect, where there's in essence less of the high price, high quality stuff. In terms of the policy issues, the key issue today, I think, for someone like the NEA or a state or city arts agency is essentially to make a decision. Here's this trend. It's penalizing high price, high quality. Do you want to fight it, or do you want to go with the flow? And I think this really boils down to the merit goods argument. So part of my policy takeaway is that the merit goods argument has become much more important than it used to be. If you're simply doing consumer welfare, it seems to me pretty clear having a lot of free stuff readily available is making people better off. And just about everything, including music, is cheaper. So it's much harder to get an economic argument for subsidy out of consumer welfare. But in some ways, it's easier to get an argument for subsidy out of merit goods. Because if you have this stuff, call it Mozart, the opera, whatever, that some people think is worth supporting in its own right, and A, it's becoming less canonical because we're all specializing more, and B, we're all rushing to a lot of gateway systems where we're doing other stuff really cheaply rather than buying the money to see Marriage of Figaro live, then there's a much greater difficulty of supporting Marriage of Figaro in the Opera House through market forces. And the core change in arts policy, I think, is the decline of the traditional consumer welfare argument for subsidy and the switch to the merit good argument for subsidy. And that if you were always a believer in merit goods in the first place, the argument for subsidy has gone up. If you were skeptical of merit goods in the first place, then the argument for subsidy has gone down. And that, I think, is essentially the policy economics of the shift in the new arts world. It's a simple way to think about it. And it will boil down in some ways to this philosophical argument of how do you weigh off intrinsic value across efficiency. So in the older times, it was more likely the economic argument and the merit goods argument would point in the same direction. The very pressing issue today, culture as stimulus, which again the Senate is voting on, I think, right now, as to whether they should try to spend money on the arts as a form of stimulus. Let's just put aside the question of do we favor stimulus, are we Keynesians, how big should the stimulus be? Hold all that constant. Let's just say you think there's some chance stimulus will work. The size of the pie to be spent on the arts is fixed. What's the best way to spend money on the arts to get stimulus? Take that very narrow policy question. Typically, there are a few classic Keynesian standards for effective stimulus. It should be timely, temporary, and target unemployed resources. I think what that suggests is that stimulus through the arts, it should be done as much as possible along the lines of the early New Deal programs, such as the WPA. The WPA was generally low overhead. It didn't work very much through established arts institutions. You just paid people to do stuff. You were pretty indiscriminate about what you paid them to do. And you got the program underway pretty quickly. So you didn't work through a large bureaucratic system of making grants. What's in the current version of the stimulus bill as it came from the House and was given to the Senate was basically a big chunk of money for the NEA, which then would have been allocated to the NEA. People would have submitted applications that would have been handed out by panels. The panels are not supposed to make grants to individual artists. The panels would have made grants to nonprofits. The nonprofits then would have made grants to individual artists. And from the mere explanation of the story takes a bit of time, but actually getting that money spent takes more time. I think the core model of what's going on today is a lot of the nonprofits that serve as artistic intermediaries, basically they are shrinking, and they're shrinking permanently, or at least for a long period of time. And they're basically shrinking because the people who used to support them are on average 40% poorer in terms of their stock portfolio. So if you think of these nonprofits as not coming back anytime soon, the current form of the stimulus is putting the money into what is very much a shrinking sector and probably has to shrink and trying to prop it up. And whether or not it would get better art is a separate question. But I'm pretty sure it would get better stimulus by just giving the money out directly to artists, giving money to people, relatively small sums, who were in some sense proposing to do something artistic, not being very discriminating, which is going to mean a lot of people take the money and then really don't do anything artistic with it, which was also the case in the 1930s. But nonetheless, the people who bother to go get the money tend to be people who are going to spend it. And then it would be, again, effective stimulus. I think when we're judging effective stimulus, if we simply ask the question, what would be effective as stimulus, we get to the conclusion, give a lot of small grants directly to a lot of individual artists right now. Don't discriminate much. It doesn't get at the question of what would get you the better art. And that's getting back to the merit goods question. But essentially, I think what we're seeing are two forces here. There's one set of views, which is just saying go with economic efficiency. That's saying a lot of quick subsidies for stimulus, just let people try their hand at creativity. The other view is a different form of the merit goods view. It's saying not only do we like the outputs that these nonprofit intermediaries support, we like them more than consumers do. Opera's important, symphony's important for intrinsic reasons. But a lot of people, I think, even apply merit goods arguments to the intermediaries themselves. They like the notion of there being this thick set of intermediary institutions which are not-for-profit, which support the arts, which have the missions they do. They see those institutions shrinking, and there is great carnage in this area. They have some sense of how much shrinking has to occur. They're unhappy with this fact, and they want to use government policy to reverse it. And again, that's a way of thinking about the arts policy trade-offs in a way that ties in analysis of the stimulus to analysis of this broader trend toward the free outputs. There's some massive real shock hitting most of the art sectors, and a key policy question is, do you want to ride this and use it for your advantage, whether that advantage be stimulus or consumer welfare, or do you think this change is somehow fundamentally wrong for intrinsic reasons, and you want to use arts policy to fight it, and then you use arts policy to fight it by propping up the nonprofits which do things like put on the live Mozart opera. And that, in a nutshell, is where I think arts policy debates should be at today, and why they're there, and what's my underlying model, and what's my underlying model of why all these cultural sectors are changing so much. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. We still have some more time for questions, but thank you all for coming. Sure. Well, I think of those as some of the free competitors to culture, which are taking attention away from culture. And in the tautological economist sense, we have to say consumer welfare is going up if people choose them, externalities aside. Defenders of the merit good arguments are, if not offended by these developments, unhappy about them. And I think that's just an extreme form of showing where these debates are. More weight on the merit goods argument, but in terms of demonstrated preference, people get something they do again and again for free. Yes?
To your point about the exogenous imposition of distraction and how that might be a confounding variable in the study.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's useful to draw a distinction. I would imagine it's useful to draw a distinction between push and pull systems for information flow.
Sure.
When you sign up for an email newsletter, there's no immediate way other than some assessment of your past experience to value the cost of your time and the cost of your attention going forward. And people over time build up preferences for that sort of thing. But the Facebook news stream, no one really knows how much time will be demanded of them catching up on all of their 600 friends.
Sure.
And it's well past the Dunbar number, the Robin Dunbar's. I
Sure.
that there's a limit of 150 that you can keep track of.
Yeah.
So I just think that you might make that distinction, and once that distinction is made, it's easier to make your claim that there's a difference between studies the cognitive behaviorists give and how people actually behave.
Yeah, insofar as you can choose between push and pull systems, you can manage your time better. And something like Twitter, the nice thing about it is no one expects you to have read their Twitter post. So I actually spend more time on it. If you're sent an email, you're expected to either respond or at least remember what you were told. So when it comes into your inbox, you have to do something with it. You can declare email bankruptcy, but that's costly. But Twitter, people put up content, and there's a strong implicit agreement. No one expects you've read it. And the fact that you can choose, like Twitter, Facebook, email, makes your time management a lot more effective. And it's another reason why I think it doesn't necessarily lower our productivity.
I would say until you made, until I heard what you just said, I fear that I may have been confusing the Twitter mentality with email mentality, and letting some of the messages that come into my inbox go.
Yeah.
Because my approach to Twitter has been influencing how I approach email.
Well, norms may shift. Like I think Facebook norms are shifting. The more people are on Facebook, the less you can pretend to be following your daily feed. I used to follow my daily feed, but now I think I have about 2,000 Facebook friends, and I only know about 20 of them. And they're all put into my feed, and I'm happy to friend people. I've friended everyone who's wanted to be friends with me, but I don't follow my feed anymore. And I think people now know they can't expect. Like some woman I know got divorced and remarried, and then she divorced the guy and remarried her original husband. And I had no idea of any of this. She's like, well, it was in my Facebook feed. So there's this like competition across networks where you're never at optima. But the fact that you can switch, like out of Facebook when it gets too cumbersome, makes me more optimistic about this process than a lot of the pessimists. That it's not just the barrage of email. You have different ways, like you can use your Facebook account to tell people you're not reading your email today, or put it on Twitter. How far does the word get spread? I'm not sure. Like I'll put it on my blog. I'm going to be away. People know, they adjust. People can contact me, they look at my blog. So the fact that there are multiple media has a lot of advantages that are missed in these studies that just like tie you into a chair and knock you on the head with a hammer a few more times and observe you don't do as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the effect of the meltdown on arts organizations and why it is that still, it sounds like you believe that there's no efficiency loss at all to the destruction of large numbers of nonprofit arts organizations if you can get grants to individual artists instead. In other words, I mean, let's say you've got an orchestra with 30 individual artists,
right,
all playing for the Tacoma Symphony Orchestra, which is going to go broke.
Yeah.
Why is it better? Is it just a matter of not being speedy enough to get to them? If you gave them, if the orchestra disbands and then you give them money,
yeah,
they're going to have to get the orchestra back together again. That's going to cost a lot of effort.
No, I don't think it's better. I think it's efficient in this sense. It's like we have is there a chalk anywhere? Well, production possibilities frontier. And we used to be out here. We were like richer a year ago, 2 years ago. Call it illusion if you want, but in some sense we were richer. And now we're like back here. I mean, that's worse. It's no doubt. I would rather had it stayed as it was 2 years ago. We have less of a lot of things, including the arts, including symphony orchestras, and we're just worse off. It's efficient in the sense that relative to your lesser wealth, you will regroup what you're producing to match to what you want. And one of the things you do is substitute into cheaper stuff. So you'll have like fewer big expensive theatrical productions and more one-man, one-woman shows. We see this a lot in theater, even before the downturn. A lot more one-man shows simply because it's cheaper. It's not clear customers were demanding it. It's a lot cheaper. Insofar as you think of cultural goods as having a lot of social functions, I wouldn't quite say there's an arbitrariness to what's put on stage, but it makes it less important. People want to share experiences, talk about things, get out for the evening, take their dates. and those social functions stay the same, people have these new points. Just you recoup some of those losses by substituting into cheaper forms of production. But no doubt you're better off when the curve was out here and you had more stuff and more operas and more everything, and it's a loss. But once you're back here, it's not efficient to just try to produce more of what you had when you were richer. Like, is it efficient for Mexico to try to produce as many cars as the US does? No, even though if they could have them and afford them, it'd be better for them. So that's like my economic model. Yes?
So talking about this price variability and then looking at individual artists, I mean, you were talking about how producers are worse off and consumers are better off because of this price variability, but looking at artists as producers and them and consumers at the same time, I mean, like, what would be your sort of conclusion what are their welfare consequences? I mean, because now an artist can use the internet in order to sort of, you know, put her work out there, and they have greater access to actually becoming successful as an artist.
I think there's a very clear prediction. Amateur producers are much, much better off. And I, as a blogger, it doesn't matter that I'm an economist. I'm an amateur producer, right? I just like sit down in my pajamas and do something. Amateur musicians are much better off. And producers who do it for a living, insofar as they have the motivations of amateurs, wanting fame, wanting the fun of getting it out there, to that extent they are better off. So content creators, insofar as they have amateur motivations, are better off. Content creators, insofar as they have pecuniary motivations, are generally worse off. I think it's pretty much how it falls down. So this amateurization of our culture, to me, is very real. People who push the merit goods argument don't like it. They're very suspicious of what amateurs put out there. It's like, here's an amateur, here's the Berlin Symphony Orchestra, and there's a feeling among the merit good advocates something's wrong in this change of the balance.
I guess I also look at it as there are, there's just 10 times more artists out there, so there's a greater competition, and so it's harder to rise to the top.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like the Malthusian problem. There's like the glut, and the returns are competed down for everyone. Good for consumers, bad for producers. And again, arts policy has to decide, are we going to ride this wave, or are we going to try to fight it? And the NEA, for the last 8 years, it really has just kept its head in the sand. And in a sense, I have double-peaked preferences. Apart from how much you think government should spend on the arts, just take some amount of expenditure as a given, and you ask, how should it be spent? It might be better to go one way or the other, like ride the wave of new stuff and try to get new, innovative content on the web using the NEA, or take the attitude, this is terrible, we need to stand up for Duke Ellington and Mozart and fight it. But what we've done is pretend there's no dilemma and not do either of those. I think it's a case where double peak preferences make sense, like we should do one or the other and not try to do everything. Because the NEA doesn't have enough resources to do that much in any area anyway. So it needs to target and focus and take more chances and not just pretend everything is well. If it pretends everything is well, which is what it's trying to do, then it's hard for it actually to do a good job making one set of things better. But the political incentive is for them to pretend everything is well. Like there's this big thing, American culture, it's marching forward, it's vaguely patriotic, it's vaguely elevating, everyone should support it, it's totally nonpartisan, artists are never nasty or controversial. And there's just like some vague sense that sometimes when I absorb it, it makes me think the arts aren't very appealing at all. That what I like about the arts is the sharp, double-edged stuff that most people don't like. So the NEA has been in this difficult position, and I think they've just, again, postponed real decisions that at some point soon will have to be made. Yes?
Just curious, the extent to which you've actually got data about producers now.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the sort of the model of musicians as producers in the 60s that you were describing. It's kind of the professional sports model. There were a few musicians who made a fortune, played all the time on top 40 AM radio, got played all the time later on FM radio. not a whole lot of musicians make a living.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about musicians now? Are there more musicians making a living, given the new systems of distribution? A living, not a fortune.
In a lot of cultural areas, including movies and books, there are data, and it's pretty clear what the data are showing. It's a common tendency. The person or people at the very top are doing much better. Harry Potter, right? But Dan Brown. The people in the middle are doing worse, and the quasi-amateurs, former amateurs, people who are mixed, part amateur, part professional, are doing better. Essentially is what the data are showing. And I don't think that's seriously contested. I'm not sure people have thought it through as well as they should. But there is some very top, LeBron James, Harry Potter, etc. It's earning way more than before. And those are, it may have to do with the internet also. If you become truly focal, you're truly focal to a greater number of people because information is cheaper. So the best basketball player of 1973, who would that be? Wilt Chamberlain still? Maybe not. But that person is not globally iconic in the way that LeBron James or Michael Jordan have been because of higher cost of communications. Yes?
Is there a way to assign an attention cost in dollar terms to these portal websites that are drawing so many hours and so much time out of other pursuits? Is there any way to do that in a way that could persuade a policymaker or give us a better sense of how much is being devoted to these pursuits?
There are some studies which are not conceptually well thought through that will say people cruising the internet at work costs us some number, and they take the number of hours spent cruising. I don't know if that's a good estimate, but let's say it is. They multiply it by the wage, and they just give you a number. And it's assuming, A, the person would have been working anyway, unclear, and B, that being on the internet has either no work value or no consumption value. So I don't know of anything better than that, but if you just want like the number, it turns out to be a pretty big one. And like if you take it seriously, it implies we're just like way poorer today. And again, even pre-recession, that like workplace productivity has been falling apart. But since that doesn't sync with what we observe, my guess is an awful lot of that time was wasted over the water cooler instead. So some kind of serious look at that is hard to do. I don't know how to do it.
I'm just wondering why there aren't more safeguards for the loss of personal attention in these systems, and why more attention analytics haven't been developed for personal, or why they're not more widespread. I know a lot of friends of mine, and myself included, we can spend an hour in our email programs and not think about that hour.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of attention given to this in China. I think like at least 50,000 Chinese are employed figuring out how to maintain the productivity of China as a nation by blocking dangerous or harmful websites. But the interesting thing there is they don't succeed, that there are mirror sites and you can get almost anywhere you want. So I think a lot of US employers, having seen this, have realized it's mostly a losing battle, and they just try to deal with it, which to me is another sign the costs are not quite as dramatic as the sheer multiplication would suggest. Yes?
The attention transfers could actually increase productivity.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's probably what is the fallacy of the argument around people doing internet games and doing that stuff, that it actually increases your efficiency of being a student.
You know, I would think you could have some kind of field experiment that would test this. I just haven't seen it. Larry?
A lot of the talk around the stimulus bill involves asking whether part of the stimulus ought to be devoted to infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some equivalent to that in the cultural sector that would make sense to think about?
I think there's a difference of opinion. The people who want infrastructure basically want the money to go to nonprofits. And their views will help high culture, but will not help stimulus, because intermediaries slow down spending. So if you look at the stimulus plan, arts aside, the infrastructure components, unless it's direct aid to state governments which have already planned something, those components tend to be really quite slow. It's just hard to get stuff off the ground. There's environmental impact, there's planning, there's local opposition. It takes a long, long time. So there's a mix of a trade-off between spending it quickly and maybe spending it well.
You're talking about building projects.
Yeah.
That's certainly one thing you can imagine. And I'm sure there are some spade-ready building projects, such as the Art Center here on campus.
Yeah.
Will not be built for the next 4 years. But I was wondering if there are other ways to think about infrastructure with regard to cultural production, where you're not talking about buildings, but other forms of investment in, say, human capital.
Yeah. Well, arts education, of course, if you call that infrastructure. But the nonprofits themselves are loci of learning and knowledge and contacts. So just to keep a symphony orchestra in business has a lot of benefits other than, the Mozart they play on Thursday evening. It's a node for a lot of...
You're not willing to think about it in those terms, it sounds like.
I'm just saying it's not stimulus. It may be a good investment in its own right. But the question is, if we're going to spend money on the arts for stimulus, how should we spend it? And then we should give individual grants. I think it's fine to say...
Why is the money that's spent on an arts administrator less stimulative than money that's spent on an individual artist? I don't understand. The arts administrator is going to take that dollar and go and buy stuff, right? Or pay the salaries of the people that work in the arts organization.
The arts administrator probably has a higher average wealth and potential income compared to the artist, and he's more educated, and he's more likely to be otherwise employed or be able to get another job. So the net stimulus of giving to an arts administrator dollar per dollar, on average, should be less than doing things for poorer artists. Again, I think it's fine to say, no, we don't want stimulus, we prefer to invest in the arts. I'm just saying that's the trade-off. The stimulus-enhancing investment is direct dollars to individuals. That's a trade-off we need to think about. I don't mean to take sides. Let's think of it as just the exercise. Here's the trade-off. If we want the institution, we need to know we're giving up stimulus. If we want to give it to the individual, we need to know we're getting stimulus but giving up the institution. Yes?
The arts administrator will pay for himself pretty quickly with efficient fundraising, efficient administrative practices, and will probably help get money in artists' hands more than a direct handout from the government, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, I'm a director of a small nonprofit, and if you ask me how many of our staff pay for themselves, I wouldn't put the answer on tape, but I know some of them do and some of them don't. A lot of people who have jobs in not-for-profits don't pay for themselves. The people who pay for themselves most easily are people who do development, which again is important, but it takes a while. One thing about development is you make early contacts, and for those contacts to bring in money can take years, which again is fine, but if you're looking for stimulus, it's not going to do that. For stimulus, you really need to target the people who are unemployed, who are a more heterogeneous group than ever before. They're harder to find in certain ways. It's harder to just lump them all into doing one thing. In the 1930s, most of the unemployed were men who were used to doing some form of physical labor and didn't have more than a high school education. So you could hire them to build things pretty quickly and get some bang for your buck. If today the unemployed have a lot of, say, investment bankers, they're not the people you're worried about. People who used to do construction, well, a lot of them were illegal immigrants. Do we want to help them? That's a separate question. How do we have one plan that's helping the non-illegal immigrants who used to do construction and the mid-level people who used to work for Lehman Brothers? Where does it go? And what do we spend on? And how do we make sure it doesn't get spent on most of the people who still have jobs? Keeping in mind that stimulus programs tend to be relatively high wage, which in my view is often a mistake. And what it means is a lot of people hang around waiting for those jobs, and you can actually lower aggregate demand. There should be many more immediate, temporary, low-wage jobs as a way of selecting for people who don't already have a job. You pay according to Davis-Bacon, you get people who already have jobs scrambling for those jobs, and arguably that's negative stimulus. So one of my fears about giving money to arts institutions as stimulus is, even though those jobs don't pay a lot, they're jobs a lot of people want to have. And if people know more of those jobs will be created, essentially they will queue for them, which is counterproductive when you want a lot of employment now. And again, I'd rather just like toss money at some poorer people, if we can. Yes?
Fortunately, $50 million is only 1/16,000 of the stimulus bill.
Sure.
But it strikes me that part of the confusion about this is that the stimulus bill is not just a stimulus bill.
Sure.
It's also, and sometimes explicitly referred to as a recovery bill.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a third concept, I think, that gets mixed in with it, which is something about building a new economic platform. All we talk about investment in renewable energy, for example, and replacing fossil fuels as the platform for a new economy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about reflecting back on the trends that you've been describing.
Yeah.
Thinking about a new platform for the cultural economy.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to invest in a new
Sure.
new platform.
Sure.
Not just allow the current trends to continue as the, as market forces would compel them, but invest. What direction would we put the investment in?
I think that's exactly on the mark. And a lot of different groups behind the Obama stimulus bill, they're not facing the trade-off between stimulus and long-term investment. There's been like a pushing of a vague sense we can have it all at once, which you might think is true for the bill as a whole, but it's not going to be true for any single part of the bill. And when you start to pick apart the bill, you'll see for any given expenditure, there's often a trade-off. My view as an economist, based on what I believe about macroeconomics, is that the stimulus through fiscal policy won't work. Aggregate demand stimulus can and should be done through monetary policy, and that therefore whatever we should spend with the longer run in view. That has nothing to do with cultural economics. It's just what I happen to think about the macroeconomy. And we should really segregate out these two aspects of the bill. But I think the Fed is completely capable of continuing to do stimulus by buying up things other than T-bills. And monetary policy stimulus is cheap. It doesn't cost you anything. And we shouldn't be doing fiscal policy stimulus. We should save government spending for other things. But that's getting us very far afield.
In fact, that's far enough afield, I think, for us. Thank you, Tyler, and Fred.
Thank you.